Okay, so thank you very much, Paul. It's great to see that we're skewed over to the right on our curiosity, that we're finding it easier than perhaps we thought to be curious today. So our first fire starter session is around shaping our collective future. In times of disruption, how can we use our curiosity to actually shape our collective future together, whether that's navigating through AI, sustainability, education, or navigating geopolitics? There's a lot for us to shape in the world as it is today. I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Diane Hamilton and Tim Munden. Dr. Diane Hamilton is the author of Cracking the Curiosity Code, The Power of Perception. She's the creator of the Curiosity Code Index, the Perception Power Index. She's on the Thinkers 50 radar, which is considered the Academy Awards for Leadership, who chose her as one of the top minds in management and leadership. Diane was one of our first guests on the podcast, and I very much remember the model that she has for barriers to curiosity, the FATE model around fear, assumptions, technology, and the environment. So great to have you with us, Diane.
Love being here. Thank you.
And also thrilled to introduce Tim Munden. So Tim is the founder of Chiron. Chiron is a consulting firm. He's an award-winning former chief learning officer at Unilever. And as chief learning officer at Unilever, he was responsible for developing the leadership capability to enable their ongoing business growth and transformation and ultimately success. Very much involved in the realization of Unilever's purpose and working with the most senior leadership teams in the business. And Tim will be on one of our next podcasts being released imminently, and there's a great conversation there that I would urge you to check out when it's released. So as we go through this session, as Paul described, we want to keep it very interactive. So using SmartLab, do go in and click on the submit questions to the panel. And after some initial thoughts from both Diane and Tim, some discussion around some questions that I have, will then be using many of the questions that you put in as well. So maybe, Diane, if I could ask you to give us 2 minutes of what's on your mind at the moment in the topic of shaping our collective future.
Well, thank you. It's really wonderful to be here with so many great experts. And I love, of course, the topic. So this is going to be fun. As far as how it's shaping our future, I speak to so many different groups. And when I do, I like to ask audiences how they would define curiosity, because I think this is such an interesting topic to even come out, because it can be so many different things. And usually they'll say things like exploring new ideas, asking questions, but I see it's so much more to it. And I love that you guys see that as well. And I like for you to just consider curiosity for a minute about, in a way, of getting out of status quo behaviors, because think about it. Doing things the way they've always been done is really comfortable. And unfortunately, that comfort can lead us to a dead end. And I see curiosity, it's the spark to everything, and for exploration, innovation, engagement, lifelong learning, cultivating empathy, which is a big part of emotional intelligence, which is what I wrote my doctoral dissertation on. There's so much that it does to improve our ability to think critically. And I've been fortunate to interview thousands of people, including these three gentlemen and Harvard professors and motivation, engagement, innovation experts. And if I ask them which comes first, curiosity or motivation or engagement or whatever their topic is, they all say curiosity. So curiosity is the spark we need to ignite, to reach our goals and expand our abilities. And the problem is we start with high levels of it, and then it declines as we age. And that's where my research focused, because I looked at the things that inhibit curiosity. Because once you know what inhibits you, you can work on overcoming those issues. So curiosity influences our collective future, and without it, we would stagnate. And I really think that this is such a great forum for us to address these things, because if we can get past some of our bias and nurture our critical thinking in a world where social media and news and everything else has been doubling down, it's just, there's never been a better time to become more curious.
Thanks, Diane. And what better way to be a fire starter than to talk about how curiosity is the spark to everything. I love it. Tim, it'd be great to hear just a few thoughts from you as well to get us started, and then we'll dive into a few questions.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Diane. It was a great stimulus to begin with. So I'll follow that. I want to start in a similar place. If you think about the world as it is and the future that is coming towards us, it is defined, I think, by three systemic challenges: nature erosion, climate change, growing inequality. We need to solve these problems if we're to have a future that is really bright for humanity. But under the surface, there are some things that are going on which are troubling. For example, a deep polarization in the world, a polarization that makes solving complex issues even harder. What do I mean by polarization? Many of you will be aware of the Edelman Trust Barometer, a phenomenal piece of research that comes out each year. In that piece of research, they found people who held really strong opinions about something, and then asked them how they would behave towards people who had a different opinion on that subject. They found that only 30% of people in that survey would help somebody who had a different opinion. Only 20% of people would want to live in the same neighborhood as someone with a different opinion. Only 20% would want to share a workplace with someone of a strongly different opinion. This is a complete blight on our ability to solve problems at scale, and the solution lies in curiosity. How do we help people to have conversations with people they disagree with and be curious about ideas? I'm a big fan of Bill Isaacs, who wrote a book called Dialogue 25 years ago. One of his principles of dialogue was suspend, find the order in between positions. It's a matter of curiosity. How do we encourage people to have curiosity about themselves, about what Jung called the shadow, the bits of ourselves that we don't want to look at, which is probably the reason we shut down people we disagree with? How can we explore our purpose, which I'll disagree a little bit with Diane. Purpose comes first. Curiosity follows what we really care about. If we can unlock purpose in more people, they will have the natural curiosity to go find the solutions and create communities we want to live in. That's why I think curiosity is such a key to shaping our future.
Fantastic, thank you, Tim. And maybe to stay with you and dive into our first question, and maybe go a little bit more into what you were just saying. Of first we start with our purpose, and then we go into curiosity. So my first question is, what is the role of curiosity in shaping our collective future? So maybe diving a little bit in there. If purpose is first, then we move to curiosity. What does that look like? How do we exhibit? How do we use that curiosity to help shape our future?
So what I find, we do a lot of work helping people find their purpose. I've been doing it for years. I started over 25 years ago with youth leaders, young activists around the world. What was very clear about them is they had enormous curiosity about the thing that really touched their heart, the thing they really cared about. When you ask somebody, what do you fundamentally love? What does success look like for you? You find once people have hit that, they are naturally curious to go explore it and to discover more. So I think curiosity has a role in helping people to apply their skills, their knowledge, their passion to the world, and to constantly expand it. So I think one thing, Simon, to answer your question, is curiosity is what helps people apply their purpose and their passion. But we've got to give people skills as well as permission to do it. And I think one of the wonderful things about the work you're doing is helping people think about how we can actually build curiosity into the world around us, organizations, education. So I think curiosity has a role of opening up the world around us, if we can do it. I use, for example, in the work I do with leaders, experiential team tasks. We use kind of ropes and planks and poles to try and trigger people's curiosity, because when they're faced with the unknown, if they've got that positive mindset, they discover new things.
Fantastic, thanks, Tim. I see the questions are starting to come in, so I do encourage people to go into Smart Lab, to our first session, and add questions as we go. So Diane, same question over to you. So what role from your perspective do you see in curiosity in shaping our collective futures, and maybe as a specific build, what gets in the way of us also in using that?
Well, that's such a great question. And there's so many things that people don't recognize that get in our way. And if you can't really move forward unless you look at those things that stop you? And that's what was interesting to me. I wanted to find out more about how curiosity impacts us after talking to Francesca Gino from Harvard, did a great piece, the case for curiosity. When she was on my radio show, we talked about how so many people think that they encourage curiosity in their teams and in the workplace and that, and yet if you ask the people who work for them, you get a completely different answer of how much they feel like this curiosity is being rewarded. So I started to look at a lot of individual and work situations and started to ask people what keeps you from asking questions, what keeps you from exploring. And that was what led to my research to find out what are the factors that inhibit curiosity. Because I truly believe if you don't know what stops you, you don't know how to go to the next level and to overcome that. So I looked at thousands of people. My research is in the US, but for years we researched so many people to find out what inhibits their curiosity, and found that a lot of the things that people didn't even consider influence them. And of course, my research found that fear, assumptions, that voice in your head, technology, the over and under utilization of it, and your environment, everybody with whom you've had contact, basically shapes how curious you are. So for our future, we have to have a plan to overcome these factors. If you don't recognize that these things or you don't know that you have this voice in your head, for example, you don't know that this has created, has closed your mindset, you don't recognize that how much you're missing. So that's what I think people really need to be working at to build a future where they have much more opportunities.
And how do we overcome some of those fears? So whether as an individual level that I have those fears, those assumptions, that inner voice, or whether that's at a team level that we have those, what would be some suggestions for how we can ignite that curiosity in a team and overcome those barriers?
Well, I really think the very first thing you have to do, and of course, when I go to organizations, I give my index, and then we find out those different sub-factors of each of those areas in which they struggle. But once you can write down, even without taking an assessment, what keeps you from asking questions in meetings, what kinds of things do you tell yourself that maybe make you not explore something or you find not interesting, you're apathetic towards. And then technology, do you feel overwhelmed by it? Do you feel like it's keeping you from going to the next level, or do you overutilize it? And then within environment, who's told you what you're interested in doesn't matter, or that you shouldn't do that? If your family might think you need to do this job, or your teacher couldn't answer that question. And once you write down these kinds of things and think about, this is really impacting me, that's when you can do kind of a personal SWOT analysis and look at your weaknesses and your threats. And then that's how you could create goals for if I'm afraid to ask questions because I think my boss will find that intimidating, that I'm questioning him. It might be just something simple that you can buffer your question. For example, Simon, I'm very interested in knowing more about what you just said. I'm trying to develop my sense of curiosity. Do you mind if I ask you a question? Is a lot different than, Simon, why did you say that? Right? I get a completely different response. So it's coming up with kind of SMART goals for each of the different areas that are impacting us and holding us back.
And I know, so we have an enterprise curiosity diagnostic we've developed with Holt Ashridge, and so one of the things you were saying there around, what keeps us from exploring and different perceptions of curiosity. We found there's very different levels of the perception of curiosity at different parts of the organization, and I know that links to some of Francesca's research as well, that at the very top may feel that actually you're very curious. When you then move down to different sections of the organization, maybe there's a view that curiosity isn't quite seen in the same way. And that barrier from asking questions would certainly be one. So a very actionable piece, I guess, from what you're saying there about personal SWOT, and maybe look at what are some of the things that stop us from being individually curious. So Tim, when you're working with leaders and teams, how do you encourage them to ignite that spark of curiosity?
So the wonderful thing about it is there's so many practical things we can do. So obviously I will start with purpose, helping people discover that purpose, what fundamentally matters, and then going out into the world to explore it. We call that often having a vision. If I've got a purpose, mine is about nurturing deeply human possibility. What are the different visions I have about how I can apply that in my family, in my work, for example? Second thing is about noticing, a very practical thing. One of the reasons people stop being curious is they stop noticing. So learning how to notice. So we get people walking out in nature or observing what's happening in a room, and then they're stopping people saying, what is actually happening now? What are you noticing? Because as soon as you start to take an interest in what's going on around us, we know data, stimulus comes to us, which naturally stimulates curiosity. But oddly enough, in a world, particularly I think in a world where Diane's been talking about technology, where there's so much data coming at us, people are becoming numb to stimulus. So calming people down and coming back to awareness. So mindfulness and curiosity, I think, are very, very connected. Good mindfulness practitioners, I think, are often curious about what am I going to learn now? What am I going to notice now? And being open to the new. I think second thing is about imagination. I think in workplaces, we've become scared of unleashing imagination. But bringing out the crayons and the pencils and the ropes and the planks and the poles and putting people into new situations so they see things newly. I'm doing some work next week with an organization on their strategy, and we're going to start with a question of what, using Morgan and Barden's thing about propelling question, and then get them to respond to that question, not just cognitively, but also imaginatively. And then I think the third thing about this is we're talking a lot here about psychological safety in organizations. Implicitly, that's what we're talking about. How do you make it safe for interpersonal risk? So I'm with Diane. It's about understanding how we adopt a mindset which makes it easy for people to challenge, to bring new things, and we take out the interpersonal risk. So finding codes for people to signal, I'm now going to challenge what you've just said. I'm not tackling you. I'm wanting to kind of create a new level of discussion. And letting people kind of label that and call it out makes it easier. So I think there's lots of practical things we can do, is the good news.
Great. So lots of actionable pieces there. So Diane, back to you. So when you've worked with teams or individuals around enhancing their curiosity, what's the impact that you've seen? So what differences have you seen as people suddenly light that spark and become more curious?
You know, it's so fun to see the light bulb go off when I work with organizations. I've given my assessment in different team settings and different individual settings, and I'm thinking of some of the training I've given where we would do the individual sessions in the morning. They go through all their personal growth and what they need to accomplish to build that sense of psychological safety and develop their SWOTs and all these kinds of things. And then in the afternoon, we would go into doing what could we do for the organization as a whole. And what I learned from just companies like Disney and others where they go back to their employees and ask them, how can we make your job better? How can we do things to make you want to be more engaged at work? If you go to these individuals and you ask them, how can we make your teams better? How can we make your organization better? And you work on the issues that the organization has. They loved giving that feedback, giving that insight, and they come alive with all kinds of ideas. And it's really great in these training sessions because you go back to leaders and you go, hey, this is from the horse's mouth. This is how you can develop curiosity based on improving, innovation, engagement, whatever their issues are. So I think, tying back into what Tim was saying about psychological safety, it's very much tied to that. It's because if you don't have the organization buy into the need for building curiosity in their culture, it's very difficult to start from the bottom up. It's got to come from the top down. And so I think that psychological safety, that curiosity, all these core cultural beliefs have to come from the top. And when you think about the teams that have been really great at having this psychological safety and this curiosity, it reminds me of Amy Edmondson's TED Talk, where she talked about how they got the Chilean miners out from under all that rock. And if you haven't seen that TED Talk, I highly recommend it, because in times of this craziness where they had to get these people out in a way that they've never done all these things before, people dropped their egos and became collaborative by being curious enough to find out what everybody could bring to the table. And we get that kind of a culture when leaders buy in.
Love it, and coincidentally was with Amy last week on this very topic. So yep, so we're seeing lots of questions coming in from the audience, which is fantastic. So Phil's asking, for the purposes of this forum, how do we define curiosity? So from the book, the way we define it is an attitude of wonder with a spirit of exploration. So an attitude of wonder, wondering about things, but actually putting that into practice through exploration. And then we got lots of great questions. So maybe back to you, Tim, with a question from Karina. So when you were at Unilever, I'm sure everyone had super busy agendas. When you're working with top teams, I'm sure they're also super busy. So Karina's asking, how do we get curiosity into an everyday busy agenda? How do we make time to be curious?
It's a really great question, isn't it? So there's a few answers to that. So again, I'm going to start with purpose. What we did at Unilever was given it was a purpose-driven company, you need purpose-driven people. Use purpose as our way in. Purpose to fuel people's kind of passion for being there. Purpose also as the basis for everyone to have what we call a future fit plan, which I think everyone in the world needs. How am I going to constantly explore and build my capabilities so I'm fit for the future? So I think you have to find things that resonate in the culture. Getting 56,000 people through a one-day workshop looks unbelievably difficult, but actually it flowed in that culture. We trained our own people to do it, and so that helped to stimulate this attitude of what do I need to learn about in order to meet this need I've identified. And the second thing that I've discovered more and more on working with organizations is coming back to growth mindset. I think Carol Dweck's work on mindset is just so fundamental, and I actually think people have been impressed by it, but I'm not sure we've even plugged the impact it could have if we really took that to heart. Are we in ourselves and are we educating in our organizations people to believe that their capabilities are fixed or their capabilities are capable of infinite development? And I think most talent management and talent development systems actually keep coming back to fixed mindset, not growth. So I think we have to unlock growth mindset in our HR systems so that people are not being met constantly with what you haven't got, what you haven't learned, but are being met with a sense of possibility. I think if we can unlock that, we really make a difference.
I fully agree, and maybe a question from Alfonso as a good example of this, and I'll throw this open to both of you as to see whichever one of you wants to take it. So he's asking, how should we be curious in times of generative AI? So an area I've been looking at myself a lot over the last few months, and personally think it's going to change a huge amount. But have either of you had a look at generative AI and have a view of the role that curiosity takes? Otherwise, I'll share my views as well.
Well, I'm happy to jump in a little bit because my research found that technology over and underutilization of it was a problem for curiosity. I mean, think about if you are Einstein and I throw you a calculator and I never give you the foundation behind it, you really might be the greatest calculator worker in the world, but you really don't ever become Einstein, the great mind behind everything. So we have to have I know Simon Sinek's have done a lot on this, talking about high tech and low tech days. And that with the chat GPT, I mean, it comes up a lot in my work just because I teach for so many universities and all the students are starting to write all their papers, right? So we don't want that. We want people to build this critical thinking. And I think we have to learn how to best utilize it. Some of this will be wonderful to expand our critical thinking skills and stuff if we can take this information and know what to do with it. The problem is it's so new. I had Robert Cialdini on my show this week who wrote, Influence, a great book. And I know his company is going into doing kind of what you're doing. They're adding chat he's doing it with Influence, where you're doing it with curiosity and combining them. And I think we're going to see more organizations find something like what he's doing. And what they do there is he's using chat to take his principles of influence to see if people are ethically influencing people in the best way possible. And I think some of these technology-based platforms can be used for good. I think we're still at the beginning of it, knowing where to go. But I think that our curiosity is going to bring out all kinds of wonderful things that it could do.
Definitely, yeah. No, I think there's lots of good it can do, but we definitely need to be mindful of some of the other sides as well. And yeah, trying to understand, but what's behind it, I think, is super key. Tim, any thoughts from you around generative AI?
So I'm going to go to a very strange place. I'm not a technology expert, but I'm convinced, with the right rules and principles, then it can only be a good thing in stimulating curiosity. Because even if it makes a certain level of knowledge easily accessible, that stimulates even more curiosity to higher levels. For me, the thing that's going to really matter is I'm a big fan of Bob Keegan and that way of thinking about adult development, from the socialized mind to the self-authoring. There's a danger that in an environment of chat GPT and generative AI, it puts people in ever deeper echo chambers. And people become more and more socialized, more and more bound to identity, and the world becomes ever more polarized. So I think the thing we have to learn is how can we help people to be self-authoring, to hold ideas and mental models and frameworks lightly, knowing that we're not defined by them, that we are as human beings deeper than that. We are awareness, consciousness, however you want to put it, and that we have minds and hearts that have all this framing, none of which is absolute, but much of which can be useful. If we can learn to hold these things lightly by developing a deeper sense of self, then I think the world will be much safer from the technology. And the technology will help us with that fluidity and that agility. I know that sounds a bit kind of philosophical, but I think what a lot of the research is pointing to is if we can deepen our sense of self and hold things more lightly, hold identity lightly, we're more curious naturally, more collaborative and more connected.
I love that, Tim. And Brian Murphy, who's on later, talked about that concept when we were talking about AI of holding on lightly to some of these models because things are liable to change. And for me, generative AI is a perfect example where curiosity is critical, because we're facing a situation that no one's ever faced before. This is new for all of us. There is no clear single right answer through it. And for me, this is where the 7 C's comes in: of understand the context, find a community of people who are playing with it, curate the information that's relevant and matters to us, apply one's own creativity, ask one's own questions, do one's own experiments, put those into action with construction, definitely apply criticality of what worked, what didn't work, and that builds our confidence. And so for me, it's a prime example where curiosity actually helps us navigate through the uncertainty that is there. So thanks, Alfonso, for that question. Let's have a look what else we've got here. So how do we support leaders in letting go of their traditional power and mindsets, encourage their teams to be more curious, to challenge and to ask? Question from Ola there. So how do we support leaders in letting go of their traditional power and mindset and encourage their teams to be more curious, challenge and ask? Who wants to take that one first?
Happy to start.
Okay, kick us off, Tim, please. Yeah.
So actually, I think it bridges directly from where I was before on changing identity. It comes from thinking that defining our own success as leaders as doing the right thing. We've got to shift our mindset to creating the conditions for the right thing to take place, and that takes a shift in mindset. So our job as leaders is to set direction, organizational purpose, strategic direction, and create the conditions for people to do that. And I think what helps us to step away from that control, as it's often referred to, is humility. A close cousin, it must be, of curiosity. In this sense that we don't always know, don't always have the best answer, but we can create conditions for people who are close to the customer and consumer to do so. I think we then come back to personal security. Insecurity and fear are terrible emotional landscapes for leaders to have, and yet it's too common. And so doing the deep work with leaders on overcoming their own shadow, the things they're hiding from themselves, they don't like about themselves. Shame, for example, is a deep-seated trigger for many human beings and trips leaders up. So I think those things in ourselves, overcoming shame and fear, and then meeting the world around us with empathy, with compassion. I think these things are the 21st century leadership kind of landscape. Doing our own work so that we're not controlling because of our own need, and then meeting the world around us with openness and possibility.
Thanks, Tim. And I think doing that work on one's own allows then the ability to say, actually, I don't know. Let's all be curious in this together. Let's find the answer together. That,
Yes.
Yeah, no longer as a leader do I have to know the answer to everything, because it's frankly not possible anymore. Diane, your thoughts?
Well, I think a lot of leaders don't look at the opportunity cost involved of not doing all of this, and they look at the financials behind everything. And I'm very much hopeful that we'll get more data. I know that you've done some great research, Simon. I'm really impressed with what they've done at Novartis to take a look at how curiosity ties into engagement. And I think that what's really interesting is if you go to ChatGPT or one of these sites and you ask, how much money can you save from being curious in terms of engagement or innovation or all the things that we know it's tied to, it'll come back with a comment like, well, it's intuitive, dummy, kind of thing. It's almost saying to you that we know, obviously it does this, but what it's obvious, but there isn't a lot of data out there. And I'd like to see more organizations find that research to share, because I think for leaders, a lot of them just buy into that. I have to see that bottom line, that it's going to improve productivity. So I think it's interesting. You can ask all kinds of questions out there of companies. They'll give you anecdotal information, but not enough are doing the research to show. And I think a lot of leaders are digging their heels in, waiting for you to give them that kind of information. And unfortunately, it's sometimes you have to start and to get that data, you have to be one of the first to do it. So if your leaders listening to this, I really would love for more of it to come out.
And maybe, Dan, staying on that theme, so there's a question here from Mark Harden of, do you see an increase in individuals' curiosity to challenge the many myths that keep getting so much visibility? So I guess building maybe a little bit on there, how if our leaders have views around things that need to be encouraged or with curiosity or embraced some of those myths or some of those ways of thinking, how can we use curiosity to help unlock a different way of thinking?
I think a lot of leaders need to get more mentorship and advisors to give them some insights. You don't know what you don't know sometimes. And I think a lot of people are relying on the past. We know a lot of companies have relied on status quo ways of doing things and have failed. And I've seen a lot of companies be successful because they look outside not just their cubicles or their silos or they go outside their industries. And that's where they've looked to get some great success stories. Because sometimes either a hospital brings in a race car team or to give them feedback on how to be efficient. And you look at other organizations, you go to other leaders, you join groups, and you have insight from people other than yourself. Because if you're only surrounding yourself with people who think like you, you're never going to get out of that stuck area that you're in. And curiosity is about, a lot of it is getting out of status quo, because the companies like Kodak that went under bought into what worked in the past will always work in the future. And if leaders have that mentality, they risk their organizations.
And if I can add to that, one of the things I use as a barometer when I'm working with senior teams on the level of maturity is, do they stop and ask each other, why do you think that? And you hear it so rarely, because either it comes with a tone of voice, why do you think that? Which is basically kind of passive aggression, or they're not really interested in each other's kind of contributions. They're just all dumping their own package on the table and moving on. So teams that can really ask and listen to the answer, why do you think that? I think they're harnessing curiosity to get multiple views and perspectives, not just heard, but inquired into, and starting to think together. And for me, one of the huge benefits of curiosity is it enables human beings to think together, not just in isolation, which is vital if we're going to fix some of the complex problems we have.
I love that. And Dan mentioned it earlier, even just adding the I'm curious changes the tone of that conversation of, why do you think that? If it's starting with a I'm curious, why do you think that, actually changes the whole notion of it from being something that's maybe accusing someone into something that's coming from the right place of genuine curiosity. So we're nearly at the end of our first session, maybe time for one more question. And I think maybe this is building on what you were just saying, Tim. So it's from Chantel. I've been feeling very curious about individual factors, so things like esteem and confidence, and how they may be impacting a person's willingness to be open to other people's curiosity, even in the face of organisation cultures or systems that are meant to support it. So anything specific around, I guess, the individual factors that we can show esteem, confidence, and building a little bit maybe on the leadership work that you were describing that people can do?
So for myself, we call this in our work the kind of the inner game, and within the inner game, there's a thing called personal mastery. How do you bring your best self? And I think developing good personal mastery skills is critical. Part of that is humility, and humility. I think this not putting ourselves always to the front, not thinking less of ourselves, but thinking of ourselves less, as it's sometimes put. I think that's a key one. And next to humility in that personal mastery box, I think you also need to put this, as I talked about before, doing your own work, managing yourself so that you're not coming from fear, and you do your work on your shame, such that you're showing up in the best way for others. I think those things, when people show up like that, owning their own state of mind, state of heart, doing their work on themselves with a spirit of humility, they become catalysts for curiosity. So I think those are the kinds of capabilities we need to build: purposefulness, personal mastery, humility, I think, are the bedrock of some of this.
Fantastic. And with that, we can all become catalysts for curiosity. I love it. So just as we're wrapping up, so we should now be able to see the topics. So as we've been going through this session, we've been seeing lots of topics that are coming, that people are curious about, and in the topic of how we shape our future. We see things like future of work, digital transformation, how do we overcome poverty, use of AI, polarization, keeping AI from being a bigger echo chamber, from technology, shift back from technology to humanity, climate and biodiversity, climate change, so a strong theme there around the climate, social impact and activism, AI again, impact of ChatGPT, social justice and equality. So lots of big themes coming up, and hopefully we'll be able to pick those up in some of our next two sessions. So Tim, Diane, massive thank you for all of that rich discussion, and to the audience, thank you for all of the questions and for the engagement with the topics through there. And with that, we will move on to our next session.